Amara left the village before sunrise, carrying one suitcase and a heart full of promises. The red earth clung to her sandals as she walked to the bus stop, while her husband Chike swore he would wait for her no matter how long she stayed abroad. Beside him stood Neka, her best friend since childhood, holding Amara's hand and promising to protect her home as if it were her own. In that moment, Amara believed she was leaving her life in safe hands. Poverty had pushed her toward that journey. The farm barely fed them. The roof leaked. Debt hovered over the marriage like a dark bird. So she left for overseas work, determined to send money home and return to build a better future. At first, everything seemed as she hoped. She worked brutal hours, cleaning, cooking, enduring insults she never spoke about, but every month she sent money. Chike called with gratitude. Neka laughed in the background of those calls, always sounding loyal, always sounding like family. Yet, small shadows began to form. Chike stopped answering sometimes. His voice grew distant. Neka often explained things for him, too quickly, too smoothly. Amara pushed away suspicion. Then she discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy. She imagined returning home with her husband lifting her into his arms. But before she could tell him properly, a woman showed her wedding photos online. Her husband, her best friend, married, celebrated by the whole village. Amara felt the world split open, but she did not break. She placed one hand over her stomach and made a silent promise. She would return. And when she did, everyone who had buried her in lies would face the truth. After that night, Amara no longer counted the days until payday. She counted the days until she could return. Something inside her had hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. She stopped crying where others could see. She worked in silence, carrying her child and her fury together. But betrayal has a way of exposing itself further when those who commit it believe they have already won. In the weeks that followed, more truths reached her. A cousin from the village called in secret and told her people had been talking for months. Chike and Nneka had been living as husband and wife long before the wedding. Some said they began the affair shortly after Amara left. Others whispered they had used part of the money she sent to pay for the ceremony itself. That wound cut deeper than anything before. It was not only that they had stolen her marriage, they had used her sacrifice to celebrate the theft. Yet, with every cruel revelation, Amara became calmer. Dangerous calm. The kind that forms before justice arrives. Then one evening, Chike called unexpectedly. His voice carried arrogance now, as though he no longer owed her shame. He told her to stop calling his family. He told her the village had accepted his new marriage. Then he said something that turned Amara cold. He said when she returned, she should not come to his compound, because Neka was now mistress of the house. For several seconds, Amara said nothing. Then she asked one question. Who paid for that house? Chike went silent. She ended the call herself. For the first time, she felt power return, because she understood something he had forgotten. A lie can occupy a house, but it cannot own the truth forever. Meanwhile, her pregnancy advanced. At night, she spoke softly to the child in her womb, promising a life not built on humiliation. Those private moments gave her strength. But fate was preparing something none of them expected. One afternoon, while checking old transfer records, Amara noticed several large withdrawals she had never approved. She confronted a trusted relative back home, and after much hesitation, he admitted Chike had recently sold part of the land Amara had paid for. Sold it, without her consent, to raise money for a transport business he was running with Neka's brother. The betrayal had spread wider than marriage. It had become theft, fraud, conspiracy wrapped in family silence. That night, Amara looked at every receipt she had saved over 2 years. Every transfer, every message, every voice note, and she began gathering them. Not as memories, as evidence. Because what waited in the village was no longer a personal confrontation. It was a reckoning. Then, as if heaven itself refused to let deceit sleep peacefully, another shock came. Neka sent her a voice note. Not to apologize, to mock her. Her voice dripped with cruelty. She said a woman who abandons her husband should not complain when another woman warms his bed. She said some women were meant to work abroad while others enjoyed the reward. Amara listened once, then saved the message. She did not respond. But her eyes changed that day. Even the women she lived with noticed. One of them asked if she was planning revenge. Amara answered quietly, "No, I am planning truth." And there was something in those words that made the room fall still. Because truth, when carried by a wounded woman, can become more frightening than revenge. Then came the letter that changed everything. A legal notice from the agency informed her contract would end sooner than expected due to staff reduction. She would be returning home in weeks, not months. Amara held the paper and felt destiny move. Those who betrayed her believed they had time. They did not. She began imagining the moment she would step back into the village unannounced, visibly pregnant, carrying not only a child, but every secret they thought buried. And somewhere far away, under the same moon, Chike and Neka were still celebrating a victory already beginning to rot. As her return drew closer, the village itself began shifting in ways Amara could not yet see. Rumors had started moving like dry season fire. Some said she was dead. Some said she had married another man abroad. Some said the child she carried proved she had been unfaithful. Lies multiplied, because lies must keep feeding themselves. But there were also those who watched Chike and Neka and saw cracks appearing. Their marriage, built on betrayal, was no longer as sweet as it looked in wedding photos. Chike had become restless. Money from the land sale was disappearing. The transport business struggled. Debts gathered. And people noticed Neka, once proud and glowing, had started arguing openly with him. The same village that once danced at their wedding now whispered at the market. And whispers, once awakened, rarely sleep again. Amara knew none of this when she stepped onto the plane home, one hand on her stomach, the other clutching a folder thick with evidence. But she felt something waiting. Not fear, something heavier. The sense that everything was moving toward a day no one could stop. During the journey, she remembered the morning she first left the village, how innocent she had been, how easily she trusted. She almost mourned that woman. But another part of her understood. Pain had remade her into someone stronger. Not harder, stronger. A woman who now knew silence can protect evil, and truth sometimes must arrive like thunder. When she landed, she did not call anyone. Not Chike, not family, not even those who still loved her. She wanted no warning reaching the people who had buried her while she still breathed. She traveled straight toward the village in a crowded bus, watching familiar roads return, each mile tightening something in her chest. Then, as fate would have it, she arrived on the very day the village had gathered for a naming ceremony at Chike's compound. Neka had recently given birth to a son, and the courtyard was full. Elders seated beneath canopies, women cooking, children running, drums sounding. It looked like celebration. It looked like peace. And then Amara stepped through the gate. Conversations died first, then the drums. Then even the children seemed to sense something sacred and terrible had entered the yard. She stood there, visibly pregnant, travel bag in hand, dust on her feet, staring at the man who had buried her marriage and the woman who wore her place. Chike rose so fast his chair fell backward. Neka turned pale. No one moved. For several seconds, the silence itself felt alive. Then one old woman whispered her name as if seeing a ghost. Amara did not raise her voice. She simply asked, "Should I come back later? Or is this gathering also paid for with my money?" And the air changed. In one sentence, she had split the illusion open. Faces turned. Questions moved through the crowd. Chike tried to pull her aside, but Amara refused. She had crossed too much pain to speak in private. Some truths must be borne in public. Then she opened the folder. Transfer receipts, land papers, voice messages, dates, proof. She began laying them out before elders whose expressions darkened with every page. Neka tried to accuse her of bringing shame, but shame was already standing in the courtyard, wearing borrowed respect. And as the first murmurs of outrage rose from the crowd, Amara realized the reckoning she carried home had finally begun. At first, Chike tried denial. He laughed nervously and said Amara had returned bitter, confused, poisoned by foreign life. But lies lose strength when facts sit in plain sight. One elder lifted the land papers and demanded an explanation. Another played the saved voice note where Neka mocked Amara. Her own voice betrayed her before the entire gathering. The courtyard erupted. Women who once praised Neka shook their heads in disgust. Men who attended the wedding looked down in shame. Even Chike's uncle, who had defended him for months, asked how a man could marry another woman while still living off his first wife's labor. Chike's face changed then. The arrogance was gone. For the first time, fear entered him. But the deepest blow came from where he least expected. Neka, seeing the crowd turn, began blaming him. She said he pursued her. He accused her of greed. In moments, the two who had stood united in betrayal were tearing each other apart before the same village they once deceived. And people saw what Amara had known all along. A house built on treachery eventually collapses under its own weight. Then the oldest elder rose slowly and spoke words the village would remember for years. He said, "Marriage is not only ceremony but covenant, and a covenant broken through deceit carries consequences." He ordered Chike to return the land proceeds. He declared the second marriage invalid in the eyes of custom because it was founded on fraud. And he said publicly that Amara, not Neka, remained the rightful wife, unless she herself chose otherwise. Gasps moved through the crowd. Neka began crying, but even her tears found little sympathy. For too long she had mistaken victory for security. Now both were slipping away. Chike turned to Amara then, suddenly desperate, begging to speak alone, begging for forgiveness, promising mistakes. But Amara looked at him with the stillness of someone who had already buried an illusion. She asked him where that humility was when he questioned the child in her womb. No one answered. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then, before everyone, she said something no one expected. She said she had not returned to reclaim a husband who sold loyalty for convenience. She had returned to reclaim truth. And with those words, she released him. Not from consequences, from herself. It was a freedom sharper than revenge, because in that moment, Chike understood he had not merely been exposed, he had lost what he could never replace. The crowd parted as Amara turned to leave, but several women stepped forward to walk beside her. Women who once stayed silent now stood with her openly. And as she moved away from the compound, carrying her unborn child into a different future, she heard behind her the sound of voices rising against Chike and Neka. The judgment of the village had begun. But for Amara, something even greater had begun too. Not the end of betrayal, the beginning of a life beyond it. After that day, the village did not return to what it had been. Some wounds changed the ground they happen on. Chike became a man people spoke of in lowered voices, not with admiration, but as warning. Creditors came for the failing business. The land money had to be repaid under pressure from elders. His name, once protected by pride, carried disgrace. As for Neka, the same women who once surrounded her at celebrations now kept distance. She remained in the village, but her confidence had vanished. Every road she walked held memory. Every whisper reminded her, betrayal may win a season, but rarely survives judgment. Yet Amara did not spend her days watching their downfall. She turned away from ruin and toward rebuilding. With help from relatives who had quietly supported her, she used what little she still had to start a small provisions shop. It was modest, but it was hers. When her child was born, a daughter, she held her and wept not from sorrow this time, but from relief. Life had emerged from wreckage, and in that child's face she saw a future untouched by the lies that had nearly destroyed her. Months passed. Her strength became visible. Customers came to the shop not only to buy, but to sit and hear her speak, with the calm of someone who had walked through fire. Some women confided their own hidden betrayals. Some said her courage had made them confront injustices in their own homes. Without seeking it, Amara had become something larger than a wronged wife. She had become an example. Then, one evening, as rain tapped softly against the roof of her shop, a man stepped into the doorway. It was Kelechi, an old schoolmate who had once left the village years before. He had heard what happened. He did not come with pity. He came with respect. Their friendship grew slowly, carefully, without performance. For the first time since betrayal, Amara experienced a kind of peace that did not demand blindness. But even before that new possibility could fully bloom, news reached her that Chike had come asking to see his daughter. The village waited to see what she would do. Some expected anger, others expected refusal. But Amara, shaped now by hard wisdom, allowed the meeting. Not for him, for the child. Yet when Chike arrived, thinner, humbled, unable to meet her eyes, he looked like a man haunted by every choice he made. He asked if she could ever forgive him. Amara answered that forgiveness and return are not the same thing. Some doors close because dignity requires it. Chike lowered his head. In that moment, even his punishment felt complete. Not because he suffered, because he understood. He had traded loyalty for desire, and in the end, lost both. As the sun set behind the village trees, Amara stood holding her daughter and felt no hunger for revenge. Only gratitude. She had survived what was meant to erase her. And though she did not know what the future with Kelechi or anyone else would become, she knew one truth with certainty. The woman who returned pregnant and betrayed had not come home to be broken. She had come home to rise. Years later, people still told the story, but not as gossip anymore. They told it as warning and as witness. Mothers told daughters that trust should walk with wisdom. Elders repeated how deception can gather applause for a moment, yet truth has a longer memory. And whenever strangers asked why Amara was respected in ways uncommon for a woman once publicly humiliated, the answer was simple. She did not let betrayal define her ending. She transformed it. her shop grew into a larger business. Her daughter ran laughing through a home built with honest labor. Kelechi remained by her side, steady and patient. And in time, what began as friendship became a partnership, rooted not in desperation, but in mutual honor. There was no dramatic wedding feast, no need to prove happiness to anyone. Peace itself became the celebration. As for Nneka, she eventually left the village, unable to bear the weight of what her name had become. Some pitied her, some did not. But Amara no longer carried bitterness toward her. Time had done what anger never could. It had reduced betrayal to memory. And Chike, though he saw his daughter from time to time, never regained what he lost. Respect, once shattered, did not return to him. Yet even that became part of the lesson. One poor choice may be forgiven. A life built on deceit leaves deeper scars. Then one afternoon, during a women's gathering, a young wife asked Amara how she survived the moment she saw her husband had married her best friend. The room fell quiet. Amara looked at the women around her and answered slowly. She said survival began the day she stopped asking why betrayal happened and started asking what truth required from her next. She said pain can either turn a heart to stone or turn it toward strength. And she chose strength. Some women wept hearing it, because they understood she was speaking beyond her own story. She was speaking to every wound carried in silence. And so the story that began with abandonment ended not in tragedy, but in moral clarity. The woman sent abroad to sacrifice was betrayed by the two people she trusted most. She returned pregnant, humiliated in the eyes of those who thought they knew the truth. But lies could not outlive evidence. Cruelty could not outlive dignity. And those who buried her future only prepared the ground where her new life would grow. If there was poetic justice, it was not merely that the guilty were exposed, it was that the woman they tried to erase became stronger than the life they stole. Because in the end, everything changed exactly where they thought it never would. And that is the quiet lesson people remembered. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never mistake betrayal for victory. And never assume a woman who has suffered has reached her end, when she may only be standing at the beginning of her rise. Even after the story seemed finished, life added one final turn no one expected. It happened during a dry season festival, when people from neighboring villages gathered in the square. Traders lined the road. Drums echoed. Children chased one another through dust and sunlight. Amara had come only to sell goods from her shop, but before midday, a dispute broke out near the elders' pavilion. A young woman, newly married, was crying as her husband's family accused her of hiding money sent from her brother abroad. Voices rose, threats followed. And as Amara listened, something about it felt painfully familiar. A woman being cornered while truth stood unheard. Before anyone asked, she stepped forward, calmly, firmly. She asked questions others had ignored. Who handled the transfers? Who kept records? Who benefited from the missing funds? Her voice cut through accusation like a blade through cloth. Under pressure, contradictions surfaced. Within an hour, it emerged the husband's cousin had taken the money and blamed the young wife. The crowd turned in shock. The woman collapsed weeping, saved from disgrace by truth arriving in time. And in that moment, many saw Amara not only as a survivor of betrayal, but as a woman whose suffering had sharpened discernment. Pain had become wisdom. That evening, the oldest elder called her before the gathering and said something rare. He said, "Some people endure injustice and become bitter. Others endure injustice and become a shield for others." He said Amara had become the second. Those words settled over the square with unusual weight. Even Kelechi, standing at the edge of the crowd, looked at her as if seeing the full measure of who she had become. But life, again, was not finished. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Dubai. An old co-worker had tracked her down. Inside was news that her former employer had been settling unpaid wage claims, and Amara was entitled to compensation she never knew existed. The amount was enough to expand her business beyond anything she imagined. When she read the letter, she laughed in disbelief. Years earlier, she left that country carrying heartbreak. Now, from that same chapter, unexpected restoration arrived. It felt almost symbolic, as if even distant wounds were returning something stolen. She used the money to open a proper store and later helped fund schooling for girls in the village whose families planned to pull them from school for early marriage. When asked why she cared so much, she answered, "Because dependence makes betrayal easier." Let girls have choices, let them have power, and people listened, because her words carried history. Meanwhile, Chike watched all this from the margins. One day he admitted to an elder that Amara's success tormented him more than public shame ever did. Not because he envied her money, because she turned the suffering he caused into something honorable, while he had turned love into ruin. It was a confession no one expected from him, but perhaps remorse, though late, had finally found him. And so another layer of justice revealed itself. Not loud, not dramatic, but profound. The betrayed woman did not merely recover what she lost. She became a force beyond the small circle of her own pain. And the village, which once watched her return in scandal, now watched her shade futures. Some stories end when the wrongdoers fall. But this story kept moving until something greater appeared. A wounded woman became a source of protection for others. And that, more than revenge, was the truest victory. In old age, when Amara's hair carried silver and her daughter had children of her own, visitors still came, asking about the story they had heard in fragments. Some expected drama, some expected bitterness, but they often found something quieter. A woman seated in evening light, speaking of pain without being ruled by it. By then, the village had changed. Roads improved. New houses stood where old compounds once crumbled. Many of those who witnessed the day Amara returned pregnant had passed on. Yet the lesson remained alive because it had entered the moral memory of the place. Young brides were warned never to surrender their dignity for fear of scandal. Husbands were reminded that betrayal may hide for a season, but not forever. And women who felt trapped often sought Amara before making desperate choices. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, people paid attention. One evening, her granddaughter asked if she ever wished the betrayal had never happened. It was a question only a child could ask with such innocence. Amara smiled for a long moment before answering. She said if pain could be erased, many would erase it. But some pain, once survived, reveals a strength you might never have known otherwise. She said she did not bless the betrayal, but she could not deny what endurance made possible afterward. Her granddaughter thought quietly, then rested her head on Amara's lap. And in that simple moment, generations touched. A wound once meant to destroy had become part of a legacy of wisdom. Years later, when Amara died peacefully, the funeral drew crowds beyond the village. Women she had helped came. Girls whose education she supported came. Even people who knew her only through the story came. And there, beneath a wide sky, the same elder's son who had inherited his father's role, spoke over her grave. He said some lives preach louder than sermons. He said Amara taught that dignity can survive betrayal, truth can outlive conspiracy, and justice may arrive slowly, but it arrives. Many wept. Even Chike, old and bent with regret, stood at a distance and cried openly, perhaps at last understanding what he lost. But the story did not end at the burial. It lived in retellings, in daughters warned to value themselves, in women choosing courage because one woman once chose it before them. And that became the final meaning of it all. A best friend stole a husband. A husband doubted the child of the wife who built his life. A woman returned pregnant to face humiliation. Yet what looked like her ruin became her rising. What looked like abandonment became awakening. And what looked like the end became the beginning of a legacy stronger than betrayal. Because in the deepest sense, justice was not only that the guilty were exposed, it was that the woman they tried to diminish became impossible to forget. And that is why the story endured. Not because of scandal, because of resilience. Not because of treachery, because truth stood longer. And not because a woman was betrayed, but because after betrayal, she rose high enough for others to find their way by her light. Long after Amara was gone, the story took on a life even those who lived it could not have imagined. Travelers carried it beyond the village. It was told in market stalls, in women's meetings, in family compounds where daughters sat listening while grandmothers pointed to the moral hidden inside the pain. But as stories travel, they sometimes lose their center. Some retold it as if the miracle was simply that the wicked were exposed. But those who knew better corrected them. The true miracle was not exposure, it was transformation. Because many people suffer betrayal. Not all turn suffering into something that heals others. That was the rare part. That was what made the story endure. One rainy season, years after Amara's passing, a young teacher arrived at the village school and began collecting oral histories from elders. She wanted children to learn local stories of courage, not only tales from books far away. Again and again, one name returned: Amara. The teacher listened to old women describe the day a pregnant wife walked through a gate and silenced a celebration built on lies. She listened to men confess how their silence had helped betrayal grow. She listened to women say Amara's courage gave them courage. And eventually, the teacher turned the story into a lesson taught to school children. Not as gossip, as character, as ethics, as living memory. Imagine that. A betrayal once whispered in shame became a lesson children studied for wisdom. There was poetic justice even in that. Then something happened that felt almost like fate completing a circle. Amara's daughter, now grown and respected, was asked to speak at a regional women's gathering about resilience. She stood before hundreds and said she was raised not by a victim, but by a woman who refused to let other people's wrongdoing decide her identity. Her words spread. Some wrote them down. Some repeated them in their own communities. And slowly, without grand announcements, Amara's story moved beyond one village and became part of something larger. A testimony that dignity can survive betrayal without becoming cruelty. Meanwhile, among the old generation, one confession emerged near the end of Chike's life. He told a relative there was one memory that never stopped haunting him. Not the public disgrace, not the elder's judgment, not even losing Amara. It was the moment she walked through the gate carrying his child, and instead of screaming, instead of cursing, she spoke with calm. He said that calm terrified him more than anger ever could. because it revealed she had already become stronger than what he did to her. When this confession reached others, many reflected on it. Even the wrongdoer had become a witness to her strength. And perhaps that too was part of justice. That those who cause pain may one day be forced to recognize the greatness of those they wounded. As years folded into memory, people came to understand the story was never only about marriage or jealousy or even betrayal. It was about what a human being does when trust is shattered. Do you collapse into vengeance? Do you disappear into shame? Or do you rise carrying truth? That question kept the story alive because it belonged to everyone, not just Amara. Her life had become a mirror others measured themselves against. And so, even after generations shifted, one phrase remained in the village whenever someone overcame humiliation with dignity. People would say, "Remember Amara." It was no longer only a name, it was a standard. And there are few forms of victory greater than becoming a standard for courage after others expected your defeat. In the final telling, people no longer began the story with betrayal. They began it with a woman who chose courage. Because time had stripped away the noise of scandal and left only what mattered: character, truth, endurance. And perhaps that was the deepest victory of all, that the story refused to let treachery be its defining center. It made resilience the center instead. In her final years, Amara once said to a young bride who came seeking advice that betrayal does not begin when someone deceives you. It begins when you agree to become smaller because of what they did. Never shrink, she told her. Stand in truth, even if you stand alone at first. Those words were repeated long after she was gone. Some wrote them on walls. Some spoke them to daughters before marriage. Some carried them silently in seasons of hardship. And so, a wounded woman's private wisdom became communal inheritance. There is something almost sacred in that. To suffer privately, yet leave behind strength others can borrow. And if anyone asked where justice truly appeared in her story, elders would answer it came in layers. Justice came when lies were exposed before the village. Justice came when stolen dignity was restored. Justice came when those who betrayed her watched her rise beyond their reach. But the greatest justice came when the pain meant to bury one woman became a lantern for many others. Because that kind of justice does not end with punishment. It multiplies through generations. In the end, Chike was remembered not mainly as the man who betrayed his wife, but as the caution inside a larger lesson. Neka was remembered not mainly as the friend who stole a husband, but as proof that envy, disguised as loyalty, eventually destroys itself. But Amara was remembered as something rarer. A woman who carried life in her womb, while carrying betrayal on her back, returned to face public humiliation, stood in truth without losing dignity, and turned ruin into legacy. Her story endured because it answered a question many people fear asking. What if those closest to you wound you deepest? Her life answered. Then rise anyway, speak anyway, rebuild anyway, love again if peace allows it, but never hand your identity to the hands that try to break it. And so the story closed where all true moral stories close. Not in revenge, but in revelation. That truth walks slower than lies, but often farther. That dignity may bend under suffering, but need not collapse. That betrayal can wound a life, but need not define its meaning. And that sometimes the woman others pity at the beginning becomes the woman generations honor at the end. If there is one final lesson carried from her life, it is this. Never assume the chapter of humiliation is the final chapter. For some, it is only the page before transformation. Because everything changed the moment a betrayed wife decided not merely to survive, but to rise. And once she rose, No lie ever brought her back down.